we've been guided here by two documents, so we've kind of built this around these documents, these NCTE 4C documents. The first one is Teaching, Learning, and Assessing Writing in Digital Environments, and then there's Promotion and Tenure Guidelines for Working with Technology. Oh, can we get our projector? Okay, perfect, thank you. So you can see the URLs there, and very briefly, I may or may not be able to pull this off, but if we have notes or thoughts that we want to take up, we've embedded copies of these documents in here, and a couple of points to note, the dates. So this is a 2004 document about teaching and learning, and then the promotion and tenure document, if we come down here, you'll see is a 1998 document. So they're kind of ready for some revisions, and Joyce tells me that they're working on revisions, but hopefully maybe some of this discussion can be helpful for that process as well. And going through these, we looked at a couple of kind of, I don't know, just angles that we could take, and we've come up with a three-part structure. One is related to questions about what is digital composing, and then another segment will be what is digital literacy, and then the third one will have to do with promotion and tenure for people working with technology. So we'll structure things in that way, and for each of those segments we'll have a brief overview statement by one of us, and then after that we're just going to invite you to come up and offer comments or give us questions and have the dialogue piece. So that's where we're going. And we'll start with Liza, who's going to talk to us about digital writing / composing.
Hi, so I'm Liza Potts. My component, as he said, is about digital writing. The statement that we have is from 2004, but in a general sense, it wasn't really off the mark. It still seems fairly relevant. The technologies that they talk about are blogs and wikis. Those things are not as active spaces, I would say, being more of an internet scholar, than other places like Twitter or Facebook or Vine or Tumblr or Instagram and all these other places. And of course, the instant you start naming technologies in any document like this, it's instantly dated. So that might even be a really bad idea for us to actually come out and name those technologies. Although anytime a scholar sees anything more than who does internet studies or digital studies, you all know this, if it's like 3 years old, oh, it's all crap. We can possibly pay attention to it. But in its general sense, I think it works pretty well for the most part. One part that kind of struck me and I would like us to talk about is they talk about two literacies, and those literacies are this idea of having print and screen. And I think so much of what we see now blends print and screen. When I think about using a cell phone, I think about locative technologies, I think about ubiquitous technologies, I think about immersion, I think about experience architecture. How do we strategize what these experiences are going to be about? How do we think about really not that separation anymore? So I don't want to propose that we think about a third literacy or a fourth or a fifth. I would think it might be more useful to think about just multiple literacies, right? Rather than trying to name all of them out. Because again, I think that might date us very quickly in whatever it is we might be doing. For example, this thing that's called Meerkat, which some of you may have heard of, all of a sudden, I know that Alice Dare, who's hiding out in the audience somewhere, was going to try to stream some of this using Meerkat. So what the heck is Meerkat? It's a way to live stream, right, through Twitter and through other technologies, and it's an app. So I don't think that we're going to be able to predict what all this is. I think that's a bad idea. So I'm thinking maybe if we were to think about multiple literacies, and I'd love to hear what you all have to think about that. And then also multiple participants, the idea of trying to nail down who we think are going to participate in these spaces is a really quick way to also date whatever this document ends up becoming or being. Alice, again, over breakfast was pointing out to me this new Nielsen report that came out talking about who's using technology and this idea of these super consumers and the kinds of technology that they're using. There's this NPR article, if you can see it, that link that's down there talks about this and has some really awesome graphs in it if you want to click on it. It might be clickable. I don't know. There you go. About partway down, it's got this fantastic graph of who these quote-unquote consumers are and what they're doing and the sorts of technologies that they might care about that we might not care about, those of us in this room.
It's not displaying on the screen.
There it goes. Yeah, so this multiple app use.
I'm not
The
sure why
screen
it's
hates
not
it.
showing up here, but
Can you just hold your laptop
Anyway,
up?
if you go to the NPR article or the Nielsen report in general, you'll find out that the spaces that are really hot, like Instagram and Vine, are maybe not spaces that we're even paying attention to. So this idea of literacies and writing, what are we really trying to teach or trying to learn or trying to assess in our classrooms or even in our own work, what those spaces might be or might become. Have I ruined everything?
no,
Awesome.
I'm not sure. Maybe if whoever's
It's
running
always the tech
can,
sessions
can worry
that
about
this happens at,
getting
you
that
know.
up there.
It's
We see this.
classic.
We see the screen.
It's perfect
fine,
for us. I
so
don't know what's going on there. You probably have to unplug
if
it
it
and
comes
replug
back
it in.
up, I'll give that a shot.
So that's one. So this idea of multiple literacies and multiple participants. And then this other focus that I would like us to kind of pay attention to, now it's darkness. This is great.
There you go. You got
Is
it.
this idea of ethics and responsibility. I'm an early adopter. I'm the old school kind that had a Commodore 64. I was on the internet in the 80s, whatever the heck the internet was, which was all dial-up BBSs and stuff like that, and Q-Link. And I've always sort of assigned stuff and taught stuff having to do with different various digital spaces. It's where I live and breathe. It's where I feel at home. This is really weird and awkward to me. I don't know why we're just not texting or tweeting this whole thing. But it's occurred to me recently that, if you can go down a little bit,
I don't think it's updating.
this idea of ethics and responsibility, what are we asking our students to do and participate in? You know, the internet has this memory, and if you Google me by my maiden name, which is Liza Kaplan, you will quickly find Liza Kaplan, who is a 23-year-old tech writer trying to figure out what fonts to use. And that's forever on the internet, me wanting to know what fonts to use. In this technical document, sweet God, it won't leave. Although there is a porn star that has a name very similar, so sometimes that comes up at least. But sort of like, what is our ethics and responsibility when we ask students to tweet, when we ask them to blog, when we ask them to do all these sorts of things? Thinking about letting them use throwaway accounts, teaching them to be able to be comfortable in these spaces, but to learn them first. Although I have my grad students tweet because I want them to understand what it is to be a public intellectual, but I also help them as they do that and show them good and poor examples. So that's sort of the other thing. And there are some guiding questions. We want to open it up now and make me stop talking.
It's not updating.
You can't see them.
Do
They
you
are
wanna
a
read some of
secret. But some of them are talking about how many programs do we have, how many grad programs do we have that actually have formal instruction in information design, in user experience, in content strategy, in information architecture, in video production, in coding. How many places are we really teaching them to do these things versus just assigning them? And how many places sort of are working on this level of expertise? So if you have any thoughts on this, multiple literacies, participants, ethics and responsibilities for digital writing and digital composing, it is your turn. I will shut up now.
Be
They're
brave.
breathless. Or not, I can keep talking. It's not a good idea though. Or we can just read tweets, you know, do that for the rest of the day.
Just shout out. Don't feel like you need to walk up here.
Have you talked more about the ethics about having students blog and tweet? Because I think they're useful as tools in classrooms, but is there any kind of a statement or a beginning statement about kind of how to guide how people might teach that, and then sort of the ethics of what's there forever?
Sure, and I think that, so I mean, there's a difference when you're doing this with undergrads versus when you're doing it with grad students, right? So, you know, we do readings, and so why don't you guys write up a reading, tell us who the author is, give us a general sense of the reading, connect it to the other reading, sort of that thing you do in a seminar, right? And you can do them as blog posts. I've recently had students, though, that were hesitant to do that publicly, and sort of a nervousness of this staying around and becoming part of their profile as a professional, part of their portfolio in ways that they didn't want to do. And it's not been all students, but it's been enough that it's kind of made me go, oh, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong. I use Storify heavily with them for that too, because it's very visual, and it starts a conversation in class and on Twitter. So some of them have wanted to go to using just Google Docs and not making any of it public. I teach digital rhetoric, which is really, the class is crazy because it's kind of like too many classes in one. And the first part, this is for undergrads, we teach them about having a digital identity and how to professionalize themselves. So I have them create an About Me. I have them work on their LinkedIn because we're a very portfolio-driven program at Michigan State. And I have them pick one other space that they might want to play in. And they can use throwaway accounts, which are sock puppets for those of you who are older. Now we call them throwaway accounts. So for them, they're much more aware of that they have to create a LinkedIn and a portfolio, but then I also sit with them and I have them really practice searching for themselves. And that's when they become completely horrified and recognize more what might be going on. Because they'll search for their names and they're like, yeah, whatever, there's my live journal from when I was 11 and I die inside. But then they'll find other things like, oh my God, my mom still has this blog up. And there's these pictures of me when I was like 14 and covered in pimples at Disney. I can't believe she did this. And then it's like, well, look at all these things that exist. And we use something called Take This Lollipop. I don't know if you guys ever have used this. It was a PSA that was developed quite a few years ago. And you attach it to your own Facebook, and it'll run through like sort of a horror movie of a stalker finding you and all the stuff that essentially that you're putting on Facebook and how public all of this really is. So they're good discussions to have, but just really understanding what you're asking them to do and the permanence of it, the terrifying permanence of it for some people. Because they're also, when you think about undergrads, and for some of us too, really, you're still exploring online. And, you know, the identity you have in one space is not always the identity you have in others. I don't know how many of you, over the last few years, Facebook has really become this space to have a professional academic identity. And I don't know how many of you that are friends with like your mom, past bosses, past employees, past students. It's become a really bizarre space, Facebook. So you have to kind of figure out what your identity is going to be in something like that. But I really believe that we still need places to kind of explore and play. And so the ethics of what we're assigning and asking them to go play World of Warcraft, what is the end game with all of that, and how are we thinking that through and the permanence of it?
I feel like I'm in trouble because I don't have a Facebook account.
I know you don't, John.
I think we should go
I don't
back.
even think you follow me on Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm a little bitter. So.
I wanted to go back to what you said about having students work on LinkedIn, because I think that's the question you really have to ask when you're getting these technologies. We're not teaching technology for technology's sake. You have an actual goal with the students that they're forming an identity, a portfolio. I wouldn't be in favor of just having, I think you run into issues when you just have something you could do in a Google Doc or in the classroom and have them submit files to you in public for the students that have that issue with it, because that's not being driven by a larger rhetorical goal. I teach classes in design now, so if we're working in a weblog, the students are designing stuff, and we frequently have the accounts locked down so they're not public for that reason.
Right.
But yeah, you have to go back to the purpose of what you're doing and why you picked that technology.
And I also would, I guess, just one second, I'll get right there. The kind of fundamental distinctions and excitement about digital writing or writing with technology that have been playing out for the last 2 decades are linked to this public nature. It's really, you know, it's a false dichotomy, but there's, you know, writing for the instructor that goes into the drawer, and then there's this other writing that's technologically mediated. And I think we really need to remember that and push on it and take advantage of it. That's where a lot of the enthusiasm comes from, and that's where these wonderful opportunities to say, oh, wow, look at these ethical questions we never even thought about. So the public thing is absolutely crucial, and I cut you off. You had your hand up, so please go ahead.
What you were saying, Liza, really resonates with an issue that I've been wondering about, I haven't figured out, which is that students seem they seem to have a different sense of what privacy means than I do. So I think when we're thinking about updating these documents, that student perspectives on this might also be useful.
Yes.
I mean, maybe they're
I had an interesting thing happen to me at the Association of Internet Researchers conference. This was quite a few years ago. It was like 2009, 2010. And I was talking to someone from Pew. And, you know, the people that do Pew Internet and American Life Project, they do these fantastic surveys trying to figure out and learn more about usage and digital technology. And it was Amanda, and she was on a panel with me. They had the most amazing thing happen where they went out and tried to understand teenage and young adult social media use, at that time social network use, right, and, social software use. And they found during their survey that everyone responded and said they don't use anything. And this doesn't make any sense. Why are they saying they don't use anything? So they went down and started doing interviews, and what they learned was we had taught that generation so well about stranger danger and about not posting things publicly that they weren't going to say that they were using it. And they had all these other accounts using all these different sock puppets and throwaway accounts that no one knew about. And it was like this extensive network of things, and they weren't going to tell grown-ups that they did it. So there is definitely a different definition of privacy that's going on there too. Yeah, you're right. It's interesting.
Someone want to take us in a new direction? Please.
I was interested when we were talking about the multiple literacies instead of choosing particular literacies that might go obsolete. I really am thinking about this a lot too because I'm afraid that sometimes I get hooked on technologies and I want to teach them and I don't know what the rhetorical purpose is yet. Like that's part of why I want to play with them is to find what could they be good at.
And that's valid, yeah.
Yeah, but so then how do we represent that in these documents? I'm thinking that Framework for Success document, I don't know the whole title of it, talks about habits of mind, and I've been thinking like maybe dispositions, and we could say tinkering or experimenting could be a habit of mind or something that we value, and so that way playing with these tools counts for that in that document, but although maybe that's just us making things up to validate our work, I don't know.
Well, I think you can't be current with the technology if you're not experimenting with it and experimenting with having students experiment.
Yeah, and then the other thing that is kind of in the nature of these processes themselves is this risk factor, to go with Joyce's theme, the idea of failure. This is, in a minute I want to talk about some of our print behaviors, but I think this is one of the most exciting things about this is it's unknown territory. There's this edge of the new, and it is double-edged in that, you know, you're overwhelmed and you're not up with the latest thing, and you know there's always something new, but that's also the benefit of these modes, I think.
Yeah.
Someone had a hand in the back there.
Someone has the microphone.
Oh, you are? I'm sorry.
Mr. Microphone.
My moderation is lacking here. Please, go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to connect what you just asked about to the questions that you started with about purpose and how these technologies that we describe in these documents are always already obsolete by the time they get into those documents. So what if we did generalize more about purpose, and if we're talking about digitizing, would it be more appropriate to talk about rhetorical purpose and to talk about the fundamental functions of the digital, to discretize and to quantize, and that, you know, you chop things up and you count them, you measure them, and that might allow connections to the folks who are doing interesting quantitative stuff in the digital humanities.
Yeah, for the digital humanities, I like where you're going in two directions. One is broadening what we're talking about will help ameliorate some of this problem of obsolescence. So if we think about you need to have an experimental stance, and that's a kind of literacy, or the ability to translate information from one mode to another. These are really helpful and longer lasting. The danger of those is they become, you know, like critical thinking that no one's opposed to, and so broad that they're not that helpful. But I think it also can work with specific, more specific aspects of technology like data. I mean, I'd be really eager to talk about data at some point, and there's aspects of data that can be generalized that way as well. So you need to be able to know how to find data. How do you get data, and how do you archive it? How do you clean it? How do you, you know, curate it? And then how do you analyze it? How do you present it? So those larger, I guess, kind of strategy things would be more important than what kind of database you're using or what scraping technique or something like that. And I think it's really well, the digital humanities, maybe we could talk about that too at some point, but the generalizable approaches for literacy make a lot of sense, I think.
So I have a question here. To what extent do we think, and this is for everyone here, that functional literacy is greatly neglected compared to rhetorical or critical literacy? And I'm just making my own observations here because, most scholars of writing come from the humanities. And so I think we're all pretty good at talking about rhetoric and critical theory and how to analyze things in those modes. But functional literacy requires knowledge of software applications, knowledge of JavaScript, which humanities people are usually, unless they have a curiosity on their own, they're not formally trained in that regard. And so I guess it raises the question of, unless you're interested in learning these on your own or getting some type of professional development, which is not always easy to do, to what extent should functional literacy be even the purview of a lot of writing programs, just because it's tough to find experts, it's tough to find people who know the MadCap suite or the Adobe Technical Communication software or knowledge of JavaScript. And so I guess my question is, another question is, do we perhaps spend too much time with rhetorical and critical literacy at the expense of functional? Even if you look at the program here at C's or even at a CNW conference, you see plenty of presentations on blogging, social media memes, which requires next to no knowledge of any type of technical know-how. But if you look at presentations on other software applications or coding and other types of knowledge like that, it's a lot more difficult to find. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to my question or my comments in any way.
I think that's inherent in us talking about technology, is that there's going to be some attention paid to the functional aspects of the technology so students can do code. I think it's going to be challenging for us as teachers because I think we do have to start learning these technologies, and I think we have to start learning them well. None of us can do all this stuff, so it's going to be slow going. And if you go back and start looking at discussions of functional literacy, you're right. I think we don't talk much about grammar. We don't talk much about style at a professional level. I think that's part of the program. And I'm just getting old, but I think I've noticed that the literacy skills of my students coming in is lower than it was, which concerns me.
This won't really disrupt us because we're kind of on the literacy topic still, but I'm gonna keep with our timing and come down here and move to our next little section here. And I apologize because this will be PowerPoint-esque with me reading my statement, but it's here in front of me, so you'll see it on the screen. Before even getting started on some of the exciting possibilities for digital literacy, I think it's helpful to do some thinking about our print paradigms and behaviors. To that end, let's start with a qualification. We're all lovers of language here, teachers of prose, poets. When it comes to worrying over print dynamics, it's not a question of abandonment or either-or digital propositions, although getting to the functional literacy, the problem is 15-week quarters or semesters in a lot of these instances. But that said, I'd like us to entertain the possibility that we're often unaware of how deterministic our discursive biases can be. Just look at the number of books written about new media, or the question Johndan and Ann Wysocki have asked about the deployment of the term literacy in the first place. We still need to ask how clearly have we examined the implications of our print-based behaviors and to be aware that these behaviors will be imprinted on emerging modes of composing. And this starting point will lead us to questions about the role of academic literacy and institutionality. We need to get past the idea that literacy is some kind of free-floating entity that can be picked up, handed down, taught in a vacuum. If questions of literacy, technology, and writing are deeply connected to a history of print behaviors, so too are they linked to academic contexts and institutions. We no doubt need to consider these contexts and this institutionality before we even get to the digital. As Liza mentions, we're also at this point, we need to extend and complicate what constitutes screen literacy. Does switching to vibrate or jailbreaking your phone count as literacy? What about tweaking privacy settings or selecting a profile picture? So far, screen literacy, in my mind, more or less has stood in as a marker for what is non-print. Moving from print to screen acts as an open metaphor for transitions without generating much specificity at all about new media or digital rhetoric, identity, and behavior. Have we actually incorporated the rhetoric of the screen into our thinking? How savvy are we about arrangement, layering, opacity, remixing, sequencing, and other affordances of the screen? And what if we move past the visual toward the sonic or even the haptic? And these questions of compositional moves only slide over or sound the surface of digital literacy. What about the networked nature of our writing? What about the insights that come from switching from one mode or set of materials to another? There's a thing, the CCC statement online actually has a typo in it. It's missing an opening quotation mark. And I pasted it into this Google Doc, and when the formatting wrapped a different line, I was able to see it. So there's this movement between modes and of materials moving around that changes what happens when we're writing. What about the relational thinking encouraged by working with data? What about our current theories that now see objects like our many devices as actants? What about a literacy? What might it look like that accounted for such relationality, remediation, and networked post-human models of knowledge in the world? Do we need to move beyond screen literacy to something more like systems literacy? And all of these questions are kind of inherent in that opening statement.
To that first question is something I've been interested in for a long time, and I think we all are as writers. I think about my teenage angst and sitting in front of a typewriter and the pencil and the paper, and that being really tied to my identity as a person. And I think it's important to think about the kinds of people that print genres and behaviors create. The single author, the solitary author, I wouldn't say in opposition, but kind of in contrast to a digital author who is by nature multimodal, who is by nature like collaborative. And I wonder if this also plays into the conversation about privacy too. To what extent are not these print genres related, or these print and digital genres related, but to what extent are they our identities? So that was a question I wanted to ask.
You want to take it?
Yeah, the print stuff is really, we can always jump to remediation and the idea that these things overlap and kind of shift and influence each other, but I don't know. I think the challenge here is kind of along the lines of the sort of invisibility work that's been done with the desktop and those kinds of things. I think the same thing can be said of print, and kind of where you're going is it shapes our identities and kind of our behaviors in a lot of ways. And one of these might have to do with this notion of the lone author, or a lack of fluidity in the text, or the finished product, this sort of sense of polish that we come up with print things. I think, when you move to digital things, there's a challenge here between kind of what we talked about at the beginning with literacy, between broadening and specificity. So I think one of the natural moves in our field so far has been to say, oh, it's not that different. So, you can make a video and you're still going to think about your audience and your purpose, and there's a lot of kind of, just communication strategies that could be layered over that. But the danger with that is it is pretty darn different. If you're making a digital video, it's not the same as a screen. If you have 8 channels lined up, you're working in a different kind of spatial paradigm than if you're working in a list of letters. So, I guess where I would take us is to think about this difference of what does overlap, or where is there things that we're familiar with that can be adapted, but where do we need to stop making that move and say, hold on, it's not the same, and there's different values and affordances in these modes.
What I think we have to and Redcom people have been good at this. We need a portable framework that you can apply to any media situation. So just because something is digital doesn't mean it's not like print, but it can mean, in some cases, it is like print, depending on a word processing page. So I think we need to get into the framework of having a generalized set of heuristics that students can learn to apply to anything, to a weblog post, to a tweet, to email to the professor versus email to a friend. They don't send email anymore. Yes, I think that's where we need to head. And if you visit the Bedford booth, you can see the book that I have that talks about that.
Well played.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, I totally understand that point, and I think that's very important. I mean, one of the things that we try to do in our program is teach multiple things so that no one sees like Photoshop as a hammer to do anything or something like that, or Danielle, who's nodding her head right there, anytime we see a student create a resume in InDesign, and we're like, stop it. So it's important to me to teach many things so that they understand that what you think this genre is and how you should use this is not always going to apply in how you use this other tool, right? And Twitter's a great way to kind of break people very quickly of thinking that. The other thing too that kind of bothers me is when we say that online or digital spaces are the same as print, I almost feel like sometimes we're doing that as an apology, and to say like, oh, what we're doing isn't threatening to you or scary or anything. It's just like what you guys are doing with print. And I think there's a danger there, of not maybe belittling or lowering what it is that we're actually doing and making and crafting and creating, that I want us to be conscious of, if that makes any sort of sense. Because sometimes I see that as an apology, and it shouldn't be.
And one more thing, I'm going to hear your question in a second, but I want to make this point. There was this great book 20 years ago called Imageologies, and on the cover it had this little circle that said, if you read books, justify it, which flips this idea that, oh, we want to be like print so we can have those values, and those values go unexamined.
Right.
So not only are there positive values associated with print, there may be negative ones. And I think this, when we talk about scholarship, might come into play, because I feel like, it's a little bit of brute force to make these divisions, but I feel like we can associate print with some of the logic-based arguments that we see coming forward, and we might associate some of these other modes with different ways of being in the world. Affect, ambiguity, these kinds of things. And there's no natural reason why being unambiguous and logical is a great way of going about things in some way. So anyway, sorry, please have your question.
So is this on? Yeah, I'm the computer science professor who's the ringer in this classroom, talking about first-year English's big data later this afternoon.
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing.
I'm the computer science professor who's the ringer in here, talking about first-year English's big data later. I've also co-taught 4 courses in digital humanities, supervised the programmer who wrote the program that was the interactive book for my collaborator's tenure. There's a wonderful chapter in a Janet Murray book that we have used that talks about the affordances of digital technology and why it's a mistake when you take the New York Times and put it online to simply create the New York Times front page online. It's a different medium. It needs to be used as a different medium. And I think this is part of what we have done. We've done mobile applications for presenting the scholarship of the history faculty on slavery in the University of South Carolina and urban renewal. It is a different means of expression, and it is still expression. And I certainly very much appreciate print. I want my students to know how to write, and they can't. And part of the reason they can't write is because they can't think. But when you go to a digital medium and you have sound and you have images and you have the interactivity with a back-end website, it is a different way of writing an argument. And it has to be taught that way. It's not, this is not to denigrate print. We want students to write, but it is different. And I think it'd be interesting. I'm interested to hear this from you all, but I think it's an interesting thing you all are going to have to get used to as teachers of rhetoric, because this is a new way of communicating that's with us, for good or for ill.
No, I think you're right. It's been interesting to watch the New York Times struggle because I've used their website since they were on the web. And they've really had to change their mindset in how they're delivering information and news and how they're interacting with their audience. And I truly hope they succeed because they're a great institution, but it's going to still be a rocky road for them. And it's going to be a rocky road for all of us trying to transition to teaching these kinds of things in our classes. But it's something we're going to have to do to stay relevant.
One of the things that's a little frustrating for me is, like all of us here and a lot of people I recognize in this room have been doing this work for 2 or 3 decades, and the digital humanities is getting a lot of play of late. And I feel like we maybe have missed an opportunity as a field of rhetoric and composition because writing is so closely linked to technology, inseparable. And there's so much interesting work happening in the digital humanities now with sound, with databases, with all of these things that are playing out. And it's fundamentally different than composing an essay. I mean, we have a little bit of a tough situation in that we are charged with helping students achieve academic literacy, and we have all these exhaust notes from print paradigms that are shaping our curricula, shaping our writing programs that we work in. So it's very difficult to just say, let's completely shift. But I do believe there's a fundamental kind of different epistemology. The relational thinking that you do in a database, or the idea that I can make an essay through filtering, you could zoom up to the level where that's the same thing you're doing in an essay, sort of, but I don't think it is. So I wonder about these points of resistance of why can't we just do that? I know we can't just do that, but I think I agree with your concern that if people aren't actually applying themselves in these areas, the energy will go elsewhere. Someone else will figure out how to do that stuff.
And we saw this happen.
The digital humanities are not so far ahead that you can't catch up.
No, I'm not, and I'm not worried about where we are in the race so much. But yeah, please.
Well, I'm not sure that we've decided we're going to do that to catch up. And we saw that happen with the web, especially if you were in tech communication at the time. They were perfectly poised to take charge of how the web was designed, but they didn't act in a unified way as a field. So they kind of got passed by to some extent. Computer science took it over, marketing took it over. So I think we're going to have to decide as a field, are we going to try and stick with our traditional orientation, trying to apply those things to digital work, or are we going to just decide to tear it down somehow and redo it in a way that keeps our goals and general tendencies, rhetorical impulses, but does it for media in general? Could be print, could be web, could be whatever.
Yeah. And I'm going to get Carl here, but I want to also just mention the ethical, and I'll bring everyone back here, but the ethical piece about the data, I don't know that much about data, but I've been trying to wrap my mind around it, and a recent survey of the Fortune 500 companies, 85% of them have big data initiatives underway. We all are involved in data composing. The challenge is most of us are just creating data for other people to use, and we're doing it right now, all the time. So if we miss the boat about how do you get from creating to acquiring to managing to analyzing to sharing and using, I mean, we're going to be off in a corner of the university somewhere doing our familiar things while these other things are happening. And I know there's questions. Carl, I'm not sure who had their hand up first. Oh, great, please.
So I wanted to maybe have you elaborate on what systems literacy, and I'll give you a particular example if maybe this falls into it, is I don't know if you read Kevin Carey's recent book, The End of College, where there's a clear opposition set up between, quote unquote, the traditional hybrid university that's print-based and all these new initiatives coming out, everything from MOOCs to badges to independent online universities. And so the question is, what role do we play within that kind of larger social, cultural battle over education, especially higher education, and the role that technology is playing in it?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I have a reaction, but I've been working for the last few years trying to build a platform for conferences. And then when I downloaded the app for the 4Cs conference, I said, wow, this is way better than what we've been working on. It's smooth, it's on my app, I press download, it's wonderful. But then I look on the bottom, and of course there's sponsored by Pearson. And I don't, I've written textbooks. I'm not hostile to people making money into corporations. There's plenty to be had there, but I'm, it becomes freighted with a lot of these kind of neoliberal, what is happening in the world right now, questions about technology. And I just feel like we just need to be involved in building. There's this great history of tool building in this discipline. And we've got to continue to do that, because maybe that's how you intervene, or that's at least how you understand what's happening or get a better sense of what's happening, is to continue to do this work. But it could be pretty discouraging sometimes, I think, because of the kind of capitalist enterprise that we're involved in various ways or not. Yeah.
Question.
Yes, let's get these two folks.
Somebody in the back.
Yeah.
Can't see it.
So, sorry.
This problem of literacy, like it becoming a catch-all term, I don't know. Hello.
There you go.
There it is. There it is. So this idea of literacy becoming a catch-all term seems like an issue to me, but also the need to develop something like a shared curriculum, right? Like we're very good with that in rhetoric in terms of having like historical, methodological approaches to it. But so much of what, at least here and elsewhere here, is like, oh, play. Like play becomes this sort of stand-in for something like a rigorous, systemic curriculum to approaching things like programming, like markup languages. The analogy I've been using lately is like, there's so many new fonts every day, right? But typographers aren't worried about like all the new fonts every day. They're interested in sort of like, what are these grounding principles about typography? And I think that's what we're lacking when it comes to this digital stuff. And the print screen thing becomes a trap, because we're still basically dealing with a marked surface, even if that mark is with light. It's still a very surfacey kind of thing. And so I'm interested, like, what's going on underneath there? What do we get at the source level? And then how can we sort of break free from sort of like stamping everything with the word literacy as our end, to be like, oh, it's the same as the print apologist stuff. It's well, we're literacy apologists. Like, we're still doing literacy. No, maybe we're not. But what does it take to formulate something different, and something that's systemic and rigorous, and that doesn't just default to a mode of play?
Well, I think, at least for me, and I'm going to bring up Alistair again. I worked on this article for Programmatic Perspectives with her about different skills for social media and different ways to deploy social media for professors. And it's a CBTSC's publication. And she kind of changed me from talking about literacy, and every time, because she does social linguistic work, and her definition of literacy is very far away from often what we do in Rec Comp. So she was kind of beating me over the head on a daily basis when I would say that word, which was helpful. And I started talking about more skills rather than literacies. And I don't feel comfortable saying the word literacies. I don't feel like I know enough about that to talk about that. And I come from industry also before I had this career, and we always talked about skills anyhow. And that's more comfortable to me, and talking about acquiring skills and picking skills up. And it seems less daunting to me to talk about skills. I don't know why, just as a word. Right, competencies. But to also just relate that to what will also happen to them in the workplace, because they're gonna have to pick up and use skills. And there's even sometimes a section, if there's a section on LinkedIn for a while, and there still kind of is, to talk about your skills, right? More so than any of those other words. So that kind of works better for me. I don't know if that quite answers that question, but.
The person with the question at the back, and we're going to transition.
Standing for a while. I guess
one,
I'm really
I have
short. You
one
guys
in
can't see
Twitter.
me. It's kind of
Okay, we have a Twitter question too, but first, you've been standing for a while, please.
Hi. So this is my first C's. I'm a librarian. I used to be in writing studies and then decided I couldn't handle the grading anymore, so I switched careers. But I do exactly, I'm just a little frustrated kind of sitting in the back and hearing you all talk, especially in regards to that first question. about information architecture and all of this, and there's an entire profession that this is what we do. It's kind of like, it sounds like you're trying to reinvent the wheel when you can talk to your librarians and collaborate with them and talk about information architecture and talk about video production. I coordinate the multimedia literacy program. Talk and collaborate, and I'm so glad that there's a computer scientist. I was so happy when I heard him talk, because don't reinvent the wheel. Please collaborate with your colleagues. Writing is...
I am an information architect.
Oh, great, excellent.
That helps.
Yes, excellent. But it's kind of like writing. Composition is one of those transdisciplinary fields where everything is about writing. Everything can be written. So collaborate with other people. You don't reinvent the wheel, please.
I think that's what we need to do. One of the degree programs in my department is actually a joint degree program between communication and media and computer science. The students have heavy coursework in computer science and principles of design, visual design, writing, 3D modeling. It's a really difficult curriculum, but it's doing the collaborative kind of things that you're talking about, so I think it's important.
And our new program at Michigan State is on experience architecture, and it's in our college, but it's sort of the humanities perspective on how to create technology and create experiences. And our students take courses in philosophy, in computer science, in art and design, in rhetoric and writing, and it is very much across all of those spaces and very collaborative. We've had students move over from computer science because they wanted to talk to humans and focus more on humans, and they weren't getting that out of their computer science program, so they've come to us to do that. So I think probably in this room, plenty of us are collaborating. I can hack my way through programming. I am not a programmer. I would never claim to be one. I am not Carl Stolle. I have to just use email and not program it before I send you an email. But I collaborate with plenty of people to be able to do that. I couldn't make anything unless I collaborated. I would just be spinning my wheels.
Great. So I'm going to keep us moving, but we'll get your
And I have to ask this
read
question.
the Twitter question.
So the Twitter question from Fountainhead Press, what about collaboration with outside departments, which is kind of what we just talked about, but talking about media studies, not just computer science and the arts, and this idea, so it's a very similar question, are we working too much in silos? Do all of you not collaborate? Do you collaborate? Raise your hand if you collaborate. Okay, I think we're collaborating. Yeah, that's a good point. We need a reward system for doing that collaboration.
Yeah, so for a while back I did a 3D modeling course with 6 other faculty across campus, and we did it without getting paid. So it was a 16-week course. I had to cover like a 3-week module. She needs to think about how it's going to reward us for doing collaborative work like that.
Yeah, and that's going to take us to Johndan's segment about promotion and tenure. But would you like to say your question before we move on in case it's related to literacy?
Yeah. Maybe I just want to toss out the idea that in this day and age, we still consider ourselves maybe holders of the knowledge, and we have the imperative as the teachers to get students to that literacy, right? This day and age, though, we've talked about functional literacy. James G. defines literacy as learning the rules and the morals of a certain discourse community. Blending that with like genre theory, and blending that with the idea that different genres come and go, just like that. Maybe we have to realize that we just have to celebrate collective intelligence, learning from our students, self-learning. What do we want to? What are we interested in, and how do we learn from each other to learn those rules? And I think the more we can embrace that, the more we'll be able to ride these tides of just constant changing and constant different expectations depending on what we want to teach.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's a perfect comment to kind of wrap up this segment, and that, I mean, it's an observation that we adhere to and believe in and really, I think, should celebrate, but it's helpful to be reminded of that, I think, in a lot of ways.
Okay, I want to talk about the 1998 Statement on Promotion and Tenure. It's from '98, so it's relatively recent in human terms, but it's very old, obviously, in internet years. It has 2 basic parts. It has guidelines for promotion and tenure committees and guidelines for candidates. Now, these are 2 parts of the same coin, so I'm going to just work from the candidate's perspective. It's the job of both of those perspectives to educate each other. So if you're a young professor and you're coming up for tenure, you should know that if you don't get tenure, that's a real bad thing for your department chair. It's a real bad thing for your department. It's seen as sort of a failure to nurture you. So they're doing everything they can, but you have to educate each other, especially if you're in a department. If you're doing things in new media that nobody else has done, you're going to need to educate them about the value of them. The statement points out that, quote, electronic scholarship mimics print in some important ways, but it also differs from print scholarship in important ways, which I think really didn't help us so much. But it also asks questions for how you account for time-consuming work involved in getting computers and writing classes online. And I'd add that finding financial support for this is very important, and you have to fight for that, especially if you're in the English department. When I got to Purdue in like '94, I was the first person in the department to get a computer as part of my package. They wouldn't buy me any software, so I had to buy all my own software. Now, we've improved from then quite a bit. Now I'm going to just toss out a few questions, and I want those of you that are tenured to talk about the process when you went through it. I especially want people who are doing work in new media. So what varieties of faculty work are we dealing with? Are we dealing with coding? How many people have coded something that they think should be part of their tenure? Okay, so this is going to be an important thing to deal with, especially if you're in a more traditional department that doesn't see coding. Sometimes they don't value it, and so you're going to have to educate them. How do we teach the promotion and tenure committees and the university to understand this scholarship using technology? How can we document what we do? If you're doing something that's a live performance, Ann Wysocki and I did something a couple years ago at 4Cs. It was a full-body Twitter thing that used Microsoft Connect and had people moving around. And to include that in my annual report, I had to get images of it, and I wish I'd had better images of it, and some video of it that I didn't have. Luckily, I was already full professor, so it doesn't matter. But if you're coming up for tenure or promotion, you'll want to have documentation of things like that. And the last thing is to look for other areas that have done work like this, because look at another academic area. So for our digital arts faculty, we were able to go to the faculty senate and get the promotion and tenure guidelines changed to take into account things like exhibitions, things like residencies. We're a very technical school, Clarkson University. We did not have any artists working on as faculty at that point outside of poetry. So we were able to go to the College Art Association's website, caa.org, or collegeart.org. They started in 1911 working on these things. I think the website came later, but go to other academic areas that are similar to what you're doing and articulate to them when you're doing that. Okay. So does everyone want to talk about experiences they've had or fears they have or plans they have for doing things to change the system?
So I went up for tenure 3 years ago now. I was put up early, and I had sort of a traditional, like enough that I could get by on my traditional like book, traditional publications, but I had all this other digital stuff, and the people that I'd helped hire in my department are people who are more squarely in DH and things like that. So one of the things I got to do, which was like awesome, my department chair was like, write the tenure guidelines that we'll judge your case by. So like me and the other people. So we got to actually write that. But when it came time to doing the digital stuff, one of the things that we put into place and put it like in the department guidelines word for word was one, accessibility has to be demonstrated. Like you can't just make your crazy whatever thing and put it on a piece of optical media and hand it in. Like you had to like talk about that quality of it. Like that was front and center. And the other thing is that you had to somehow document the process. So in my department, all of my untenured colleagues who are coming up, they have GitHub accounts, and they're doing all of their stuff in GitHub so they can not only say, here's this widget I built, but here's this widget I built as it developed over time, and it's documented. Here's the process. You get date stamps so that you actually get to see that thing in the missing sort of fourth dimension of digital work, right? People don't question like, oh, if you wrote a book, you know, that probably took 10 minutes, right? Like we don't worry about that kind of thing. But with digital stuff, people never know like, well, how much of this is you and how much is the software? So I'm happy to share those guidelines. I think they're probably public somewhere, but that's a really big opportunity. So if you get asked to do that kind of thing, that makes a very big, paves the way for other people to do things really well. So if you're sort of on that cusp where you're about to go up for tenure, if you've got like the strong traditional case, all the more reason to really play up your digital stuff because maybe your case doesn't rest on the digital things, but it shows the department, like I got to show my senior colleagues like how to look and how to read these things. So you can be an advocate that way just by putting that stuff up in your portfolio, even if you don't need it.
Yeah, I think it's very easy for the deeper stuff, application, for example, to seem like it was easy for you to do. Because they know software from being a user of software. They don't see the work that goes on. So I think that's a really good, doing things in GitHub, which if you're not familiar is a versioning system, so you can always go back and see what work was done at different stages of the project. Making that work visible to your department and your school is important.
Yeah, and particularly given the fact that, transparency and ease of use is a feature in software, so you hide the messiness. And, I've had this experience where I showed my department chair something I spent a lot of time on, and he said, "Oh, it's so easy. You just click this button." And immediately I knew I was in trouble, and I started printing out, Perl scripts and handing them to the chair. So.
Well, I'm in my first academic position out of graduate school, and one of the things that I tried to negotiate for and was successful with was that because I'm a digital artist too, so I've kind of come in on both sides, and they were able to actually draw some of the requirements for tenure promotion from the arts department and apply that to my own tenure line, which is really nice. So I think like seeking precedence not only within the field, but also across departments and within the college has been really useful, and it's working out pretty well. So.
Yeah, you have to articulate, connect to something else that is already approved.
Absolutely, and I love the idea that you're able to borrow from art or from some other disciplines that maybe have different ways of going about this, because the gold standard has always been the book or the journal article, and these are these tendrils that are still in place. But what about performance? And all of those things are just incredibly valuable. Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing from the panel on what you see as the value and limits of curation as a frame. I'm not looking for an umbrella term, but I'm looking for it as a descriptor of some of the activities that we've been talking about today. On the one hand, it, I think, productively resituates things in the direction of the kind of collecting and evaluative work that some of the stuff that we're talking about is about. It also has that whiff of the museum and a kind of high culture resonance, which is sometimes at odds with some of the things that we want our students or that we ourselves end up doing. I'm interested in hearing from you about how and whether you see curation as a term that can and should fit in the kind of discussions we're talking about.
I love that term, and Johndan mentioned the connections with libraries and library sciences in this kind of work, which I think is really valuable. I guess two things I'd mention about it. One is the idea of ready-made materials is something we should probably pay some attention to, because it gets against these earlier notions of originality, and there's so much stuff out there that it's perfectly, it's a perfect career to just curate, to find all the stuff that's out there and figure out how to do it. So there's no problem with us needing to make more stuff, and figuring out how to kind of deal with the stuff that we have is super valuable. And the curation also brings in from library science, but also from like digital editing, some of the ideas about sort of the transparency and the methods and the descriptions. It's very theoretical. So, if you say, I made the decision to use this textual variant versus this one, and here's my thinking about it, and here's the implications of it, and you figure out a way to put all of that on the table as part of this curation, it's incredible intellectual work, and I think it's a great space for us to be working in.
My only concern with the term curation is it's, I think, gotten watered down by the hipsters. I think if you want to use curation, I think you need to approach it from a museum standpoint, where there is a scholarship about curation, where there's an active dialogue, and that would be something that you would articulate to in your arguments about promotion and tenure, is by going back to those fields, not just, my Tumblr has a lot of cool images in it. That they call it curation, which I think doesn't help.
I'm curious about talking about assessing the quality of our digital work and having our colleagues, especially in literature, assess that. I kind of have a more cynical sense that I could document all of the hours I spent on a project like a lawyer, and they would say, cares? Like, that was a giant waste of your time because the thing that you made is not valuable.
That's a
So,
danger.
I mean, if you're in a place where people think that co-authoring with somebody else means you're doing 50% of the work, how do you talk about the quality of these texts when that's still a disciplinary question that's up in the air for us, right? When I teach my writing technologies graduate seminar, we look at these texts and we're like, how do we even count this as scholarship? How do we consider it scholarship? What is it doing that a print article isn't or is doing? That's still an open discussion for us. How do we then make it like it's a closed final thing when we're talking about tenure or promotion?
Excellent. Does it make sense to read
So,
that question
yeah,
now?
so there's a question that came in through Twitter that really kind of dovetails into that, asking, can we speak to how you see our ways of knowledge making shaping the kinds of knowledge we make, which I think is really what you're talking about there. So if we want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's this educational component and this kind of unfamiliarity dynamic at play. And I think so far the response has been, well, find good outside reviewers who can evaluate the stuff. If your colleagues can't do it, you either educate them or you find others who can do that. And I think that's probably a pretty good path to go down, actually, in some ways. But
Maybe I've just been lucky, but the institutions where I've been at, that's been the model for evaluating the quality of something was, even if I was at Purdue and I came up early for tenure, and when I came up for tenure, there was still a lot of faculty in the literature program that I think thought I was a grad student. They would come into my computer class and ask me to help them do things. That's not a joke. That was a joke. But when I came up early, there was a senior faculty in Ret Comp who was going to present my case to the fairly serious P&T committee. But that person deferred to another senior faculty member who knew my work well, and that was enough for the committee. They're not going to try and roll over you if you can get expert opinion saying that your work has value and is good work. So just like we've been saying, work to educate people.
yeah, and another piece of that is I don't like the this is a lot of work argument, like I'm going to show my work. I think in some ways when that's serving the educational function, it's really valuable. But there's been this sort of, I don't know, complaint in the air for people who do this work for a long time about having to do double duty, which is, okay, I had to build the platform and now I have to write it up and explain it to people, or I have to write the book about it or what have you. And I think that's a legitimate concern. People have had to do that in some ways. But when it turns into just like I'm doing all this extra work, I don't think that's not the path we want to go down. It's a different path that we need to find, and maybe it does have to do with this kind of epistemological, or like this is actually a very different kind of knowledge. Let me teach you about it. Let me find other people who know something about it, who can vouch for me. Seems like, I don't know, seems to work somewhere.
Yeah, and I think even picking a different way to talk to your colleagues in your own department about it. Like, I've always been the kid in the office where everyone runs to, come fix my computer. I'm sure you all are that person in your department. Come fix my email, come fix my computer. I hate Desire to die, can you fix that? That sort of stuff. So we recently got at MSU our own distribution of Google Drive, where we would keep the intellectual property, supposedly, of everything created in Drive, everything stored in Drive, and the same for our students. They would own and keep their work. So it's sort of an interesting moment where a lot of people have moved out of the learning management system. And so I've figured out like how to structure my classes so that when I use Drive, it looks really awesome, it works well, everything's organized, and I love it, and it's fantastic. And I recently talked to our first year writing faculty, and they had me in there for part of a workshop to show them how I was doing it. So it wasn't a matter of me going, oh, just move over and I'll set up your folders for you and then everything's awesome. But it was me explaining, intellectually, why would we use Google Drive, and why do students have more agency when we use Drive, and why do they own their own material, and why is this more flexible, and you can call things whatever you want to call them, you can save them in different ways, and we can write collaboratively. So sort of like giving them a framework around why you might use a certain technology rather than just fixing their email, I think is also a way to kind of explain to them why what you're doing isn't just hacking away and clicking some buttons, but that you've really done something thoughtful here. You've researched something and you've made decisions around use and context rather than just being that person in the corner that fixes their email. I think that's really important.
I think it's also dangerous when you're in that position because of the way the university is structured, because the work that you're doing is new and seems technical to them, you can become part of the support staff. I know that when we opened our new computer lab in the building I'm in, the first day, an accounting professor came in and wanted to make my assistant go fix his computer. And I said, that's not his job.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to make him fix the computer. And I said, are you going to balance my checkbook for me? And he got the point. I apologized. Yeah, so if you're in that position, make sure you're not getting taken for granted.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
That's when you close your door.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I just take this question in a second, but these documents that we started out with actually can be pretty helpful. So when my tenure case came up, I used that 1998 document that said it should be evaluated in the medium in which it is produced. And so when you put your argument together, relying on those can be helpful, and also relying on people who've come before you. And I think some of us need to stop writing books, because a lot of us are just like really hard workers, and we come up for tenure and, oh, we have a book, we've been doing all this stuff, but we also have done this, and we've kind of hedged our bets and all this. So there aren't as many case studies out there, I think, of people who have said, I've decided to forego that opportunity, and all I've done is curate these materials. When we have more of those to refer to, it'll be better too, and maybe even in these documents. Please.
I was going to say, you can use the computer to help you in this as well. I spent 9 years as chair and interim dean, and one of the cases I made was to point out that the guy coming up for tenure had a website that had twice as many hits and more dwell time than the guy who edited the journal for the Professional Society on the same topic. And you can use Google Analytics and similar analytics to demonstrate that you have impact, which is what you really want to try to do when you bring a tenure case.
That makes good sense, and I started at the beginning saying I'm a lover of language and really appreciate books and all of this, but I really have a hostility for the paradigm through which recognition plays out in a lot of departments, whereby you have a small area of expertise, and there's a circle, a cabal of folks who are experts in that field, and you send your book out, and 100 of them read it, and put a good stamp on it and say this is wonderful, and thereby you get promotion and all of these wonderful things that come to you, and someone else has built a tool that is helping 10,000 people. And so these analytic measures may be another path that we can go down in some ways.
Yeah, it kills me when well, I don't know if you guys ever upload your presentations to SlideShare, and when I look at the amount of views that my presentations get on SlideShare, that there is no way that audience ever fit into a room. There's no way they ever fit into my city sometimes. It's just like, how are we going to figure out how to make that count? Or how many followers I have on Twitter? Some of them might even be people and not just bots. So how do we measure that? And the fact that our knowledge is getting out there and no longer confined to a journal article that maybe 3 people in this room and my mom read, the idea that knowledge is getting out there in ways that was never possible before, how are we going to measure that and then pull that back? I'm trying to figure that out as I go from associate to full. I know that writing the book is the easy route for me, right? Lock me in a room for a month and I'll come out with a book. But it's not what I'm known for doing. So I'm not quite sure who that's going to serve. At the same time, I'm not quite sure how to tell the committee that's going to promote me, hey, did you see my slide shares? It's got like 4,000 views on one of those. And that to me is much more huge than the 100 copies of a book that I sold. So I think that's definitely going to be an issue. We need more people who are full, that understand what this is and can write these letters for us and really situate and explain to these committees what this is.
Maybe just following up on that, kind of at the other end of the spectrum, I think in addition to scholarship, it's really important to consider teaching and the kind of ongoing, incredibly time-consuming and innovative work that we do when we teach digital stuff in our classes, and especially considering the fact that in our field so many people are hired, as adjuncts and lecturers, and they're hired for teaching, so they need to be assessed on how well they do this, and it's it's kind of it's a shifting, constantly shifting territory in which you have to be successful with students. So I think that's an important consideration as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't talked a lot about how to value teaching, but that's one of the ways that I see some of the technology work, quite a bit of it actually, should go in the teaching bin, as part of our tenure cases, promotion cases. and doing it in a way that makes the amount of work involved in, say, teaching a module on JavaScript clear to the Promotion and Tenure Committee. I also think we have to be careful to separate scholarship from teaching. And it's a difficult separation because they do overlap sometimes, but I think some people have a tendency to try and push teaching into scholarship. And I think if you're going to do that, you'd have to write a book about the teaching experience, a pedagogical book. You know.
I don't know. A lot of my scholarship has been about teaching too. It's very hard for me to separate the two, and I feel like, I mean, that's one of the nice things about working in this discipline of rhetoric and composition is in many ways, the teaching is a subject for deep intellectual inquiry and experimentation and all of these things. And I feel like if digital work can be transformative and break down boundaries, maybe there is a way in which it can do some of that, but these categories, are tricky.
Yeah, and somebody earlier mentioned the fact that sometimes our students teach us, and I think you need to embrace that. So if you're not comfortable with a specific kind of technology, find a TA or a research assistant to work with you and value their knowledge. I mean, it takes a little bit of courage to say, I don't know how to do this, can one of the students show me? But I do that in my classes all the time. Once the students start to understand that it's a mutual learning experience and that you're guiding everything, then they start to value it as well. So if you don't have a TA course, an undergrad TA course on your books, you should try to get one added for things like that, because the students really like it when they do it, when they TA. They love to put that on their resume or their grad school application. I worked as a TA when I was a senior undergrad.
Yeah, and I want to make an even stronger statement actually about it. I mean, I feel like let's just move teaching up, depending on what kind of teaching it is. If it's the kind of transformative teaching that's involved with this sort of experiment, wow, there's this new thing called Meerkat, we have no idea, we need to figure it out. Let me do this together with my students, and then let me write it up, and I'll share it, and maybe I'll tweet it about, and 1,000 people will come see it. That to me is as valuable, more valuable than, lone scholar in office writing article X. So, if we are thinking about new guidelines and new documents, maybe we should just say transformation is where we're going, or experimentation that has a positive yield for a great number of people, and that could happen in all kinds of different ways.
I think the other thing that you'd want to document is the fact that, at least for me, and I'm sure all of you, every time I teach a class, I'm having to almost do a new prep. I mean, it's a constant. Nothing sits still. I had a heart attack because about 2 months before I was going to teach my digital rhetoric class again, I noticed that my book was 3 years old. Oh God, what am I going to do now? I need a new book. And it's not like the main topics change, but you have to rethink about the readings that you're going to do and what's going to be new and current, especially if I walk in the door, at least with our students, and God forbid I should show them anything old and not connect it well enough to what's going on now. It's like end of discussion. So I think being able to document in your teaching the amount of effort that goes in to stay current, to update what it is that you're doing is imperative.
Yeah, and your colleagues, even if they're not in our field, will understand. When I was at Purdue, the assistant department chair at the time was a Shakespeare scholar, and we were talking about prepping courses, and we didn't really get along, but he understood me a little bit that day because he said, I've been using the same lectures and the same syllabi I've been using for 20 years. Nothing changes that much in undergrad Shakespeare studies. You're having to do a new syllabus every time you teach. And I said, yep, every time.
Well, we did a poor job of typing while we were talking and updating these documents, so, but I really appreciate the conversation. I think it was very intellectually invigorating, and I'm sure we would be happy to continue the conversation as well after this. I think we're out of time, so thank you very much. Yeah, how about if Liza can make it shareable and tweet it or what have you, or
I'll
come
use
up
the
and...
Twitters.
Yes.